Hello, this is WJOP LP Newburyport. I'm Jessica from NCM Hub, and you're listening to Joppa Radio 96.3. And we're here with author James Sullivan, local author from Amesbury, Massachusetts. And we're talking about his, is it your latest book, James?
Yes.
Latest book. Which
came out
side are
earlier
you
this year.
on? So it's a book about American protest songs over the history of America and how it's really shaped America.
Right.
Right. So, yeah, so we're just going to listen to a little bit about how you came to write this book and a little bit about, like, what your favorite parts are and the most moving parts. So I know that you were a former music critic.
Yeah.
Right? So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I've been writing about music most of my life. Can I take these off or no?
Take 'em off.
Yeah, okay. I've been writing about music most of my life. It's kind of what I wanted to do from a very young age. I worked in San Francisco for about 10 years. I'm from Massachusetts, but worked in San Francisco for about 10 years after moving around the country a little bit in my younger years. And while I was there, I was one of the music critics at the San Francisco Chronicle. So that was a great city to do that in, and there's a great music history in San Francisco, and that was a lot of fun. And my wife and I moved back to Massachusetts about 15 years ago, and we've been back here ever since, raising our kids, living in Amesbury. And I still do a lot of writing about music. I spent several years as an editor for Rolling Stone. I write for the Boston Globe these days, and a lot of the stories that I do are about musicians and music. I'm not really a music critic anymore, but I definitely still write a lot about music. And then I've written 5 books, this being the 5th, and they're on a variety of subjects, mostly about sort of Americana. My first book is about the history of blue jeans and what they mean to American culture.
Interesting.
I wrote a book about James Brown. So that obviously a music book. I wrote a book about the comedian George Carlin and what his comedy meant to American culture. So all my books are sort of about cultural things and what they mean to America. And so this book, again, my 5th. I've been thinking about doing something like this for the last 10 years or so, I would say. I started thinking about it during the Occupy Wall Street protests, really. I've always been fascinated by music with a message. James Brown actually wrote a bunch of songs that were, what he actually called message songs, which were, sort of about, living a better life, the civil rights movement. He was obviously prominent in that period. So that was one of the ways that I was thinking about this. But really during the Occupy Wall Street movement, it occurred to me there was so much coverage of that for a year or so, around 2009, 2010. And a lot of the coverage was about, hey, there's this pretty cool street-level movement going on, this idea of we're the 99%, we should have at least as much sway as the 1%, the billionaires in this country. And there were all these rallies that were getting a lot of press coverage, a lot of nightly press coverage and news coverage. But a lot of the stories were like, this kind of looks like a throwback to the 60s, except for the music. Where's the music? And my thought was, you're kind of not looking closely enough, because especially the big rally that took place over a period of months near Wall Street in New York City, there was music there every day, and it was part of the coverage. So it was sort of like, why are you missing that? There is definitely music. It was a festival atmosphere. There were all those folks, making speeches and talking to each other and doing the talkback thing, where it was supposed to be totally democratic. So they didn't have microphones. Somebody would talk, and then everybody would repeat what they said to amplify them, like in this, democratic way, rather than having one person in power speaking. And then they had lots of music, and some of the musicians were old throwbacks to the 60s. Crosby and Nash showed up to perform because they felt moved by this movement. And then there were hip hop artists, and there were sort of indie rock artists showing up because they also felt compelled to speak to address this movement and present songs that they thought spoke to what the folks in that movement were doing. So it just occurred to me that, there are protest songs everywhere. And, I felt like some folks were missing that, missing an opportunity to talk about them at the time.
Right. But do you think that there might still be a little bit of a gap in today's musicians? Do you think that there are as many protest songs being put out by popular artists? Like pop?
It depends on where you look. So one of the things that I wanted to show in this book is that there's a wide variety of what can be termed a protest song, or in my mind anyway. I think we have a narrow definition collectively of what a protest song means, and we tend to think of it as, one man or woman with an acoustic guitar, singing specifically about a political issue in the 60s style. And I think that there's a lot more varieties of protest music. So one of my theories that I've put forth in this book is that there are whole styles of music that were born out of a sense of protest. So the blues of the 1920s, for instance, was a kind of protest against civil rights injustices that had gone back into the 1800s, the 19th century. Rock and roll itself, I think, was a form of protest in that it was about the new, quote unquote, new teenage culture. After World War II, for the first time ever, teenagers in the affluent American society found themselves living independently, able to, earn their own money, get their own cars, live their own lives, whereas every previous generation in basically the history of man, there was no such thing as a teenager. It was a young adult who went to work on behalf of the family.
Very true.
So rock and roll itself was kind of like an eruption of, we have a voice too. We might only be 16, 18, 20 years old, but we have a voice too. And it wasn't specifically political, obviously, but just the fact that they could make noise and be heard and have the older generations say, turn that racket down,
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Can I get in there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, I was, after talking with Art Courier about, he's trying to, group the young voice in, sort of aggregate it so that and to have a platform for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because when I went to, something was here in town, there was a lot of poetry about the, protest poetry, you could say. But I think that there will be more young people coming up with songs. I mean, I've heard songs in the more roots music.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that they don't grab on like they had with those one song that, everybody knows. But that's really the way it's with so many songs now. There's so...
Well, because of the internet, songs are all over the place, and it's not just like a top 40 chart that everybody listens to.
Right.
Everybody has their own micro genre that they listen to, and it's spread out all over the place.
Yeah.
But so to pick up where I left off, that there have been other forms of music that have come after rock and roll that I think also were born out of a spirit of protest. So disco, in a way, although most of the songs have nothing to do lyrically with any kind of a political movement, just the fact that the music existed was sort of one of the first opportunities for the LGBT community to say, we are here, we exist, get used to it. And then hip hop, to bring things up to the present day, there's clearly a lot of hip hop about, discouragement over living conditions and, the class divide in America and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of hip hop songs that I would think of as protest songs. And then just as one simple example of a pop song, to go back to what we used to think of as top 40, the 40 songs that everybody was listening to in the country at the time. Born This Way by Lady Gaga was a huge hit when she recorded it, and it was very clearly about the LGBT movement. And so that's an example of a song that, is... it's a protest song. It just doesn't sound like Bob Dylan or Pete Seeger singing with an acoustic guitar, so people might tend to, overlook the fact that it is, in fact, a kind of protest song. So that's kind of what I was trying to get at with this book, that there are certainly the Bob Dylans and Pete Seegers of the world, and we need them now more than ever, the younger versions of those guys. But there are also lots of others, pop songs, and there's, all kinds of music that could be considered forms of protest music, too.
Yeah, that's very true. You definitely have me thinking more so about what artists are kind of rising up and really talking about issues.
Yeah.
So Lady Gaga is a great example of
for sure. I mean, she did when she played the Super Bowl halftime show a couple of years ago.
Right.
She went out of her way to not only play Born This Way, but she also opened with this sort of like patriotic spectacle thing where one of the songs that she did was This Land Is Your Land by Woody Guthrie, but her own version of it. And that song is protest. That song sounds like, the alternative national anthem, but really he wrote it saying, there's verses that a lot of performers didn't sing over the years. There's a verse about do not, don't walk on my grass type signs. There's a whole verse about this is supposed to be everybody's land. You can't tell me I can't walk on this grass. And the way the line goes is that on the other side of the sign, as he sings, it doesn't say anything. So that side was made for you and me. The side that doesn't say "Don't walk on my grass." The country's supposed to be for everyone, not just for a select few or a select group of owners.
And
she sang that
for now too.
Right, and she did that at the Super Bowl, which of course is about as patriotic, as American as we get as far as spectacle goes.
Yeah, Lady Gaga tends to make a spectacle wherever she goes, and I have listened to her talk a lot, and it's actually pretty interesting because she has been a woman in the industry who's been told to be sexualized and told to do all of these things that she wants to take control. So that's why she makes like a big fuss every time she is told to wear an outfit. She changes it completely and turns it into something totally different. So yeah, she's definitely an inspiring artist today.
Right.
I would agree. But
so there's so many examples of stuff like that. There are lots of indie type artists that are also making specifically political music. So I'll give you one example. A woman who was just sort of a YouTube phenomenon. I don't even think she had a recording career at the time. She made a YouTube video of her new song, which was called My President Sang Amazing Grace. And it was right around the recent election of the new president. And it was a lament for the outgoing previous president, and she was specifically singing about when President Obama sang Amazing Grace. He went to the memorial service for the folks who got killed in the church in South Carolina. And he was so emotionally shook up that he just sort of spontaneously started singing Amazing Grace. And so this song that this sort of unknown writer created, which became a YouTube phenomenon, was called My President Sang Amazing Grace, and she was sort of, sticking a needle in the next guy, saying, I don't think you'd be the guy to do that. So that was a kind of protest. And just to bring this back to the classic era of protest, Joan Baez somebody said, Joan Baez, you should listen to this song, and she loved it and recorded it for her next album. So this basically unknown singer has Joan Baez covering her song because it was a newfangled kind of protest song.
That's interesting. Yeah, definitely today too. I think that music is becoming more saturated because of the internet. So maybe it's harder to really pick out a lot of it because you just have so much input. But at the same time, like you just said, maybe he wouldn't have been able to find her without the internet.
Absolutely. So. It's sort of there's two sides to that coin. I mean, it's harder to get heard. There's a million things out there. There's a million, worthy artists creating music. But at the same time, things of interest bubble up, and a songwriter like her gets heard, whereas in previous decades, maybe the record company would have said, not interested, never heard of you, and she never would have been heard.
Right.
She wouldn't have had a way the only way she would have had to get heard would be to get her records in the stores and get on the radio, and neither of those things were going to happen for her. But, because of YouTube, she was discovered by Joan Baez, and her song became, a sort of a viral phenomenon. So
yeah, it's kind of funny.
Cool. Do you know Joan Baez?
I don't think so.
Well,
I
so
mean, of course I do.
yeah. So Joan Baez was actually got her start in the late '50s in Boston, in the folk scene, and she was alongside Bob Dylan.
Joan Baez.
Joan Baez.
You were born, Jess.
So that's kind of one of the ideas about this book is that yes, there are no problem. The idea is that there are sort of classics of folk music. Everybody knows who Bob Dylan is to some extent, and most people who know anything about Bob Dylan know that he at least got started by writing protest songs, and then veered off and did a bunch of other, changed his career a million other times. But Joan Baez was like his female twin. They were actually boyfriend and girlfriend for a while, but she was also at the time, like in the early '60s, considered like he was, the darling of the folk revival scene, and very political, and very much showing up at rallies for civil rights and free speech and other issues of the day, and was very committed to that stuff. And she's still around, as is he. But just the fact that she would be covering a song by a much younger songwriter, sort of speaks volumes to the fact that there is definitely still protest music if you know where to look for it.
Yeah, I think when I, asking Jess if she knew who Joan Baez was, it is so that group of artists were so known for protest music, and then there was sort of a lull. I mean, music is, Tyler did a good playlist really up to today of some example, but not those that everybody knew, the song. That would be very cool if a young artist came up with a song that really started hitting all culture like it had before, that we all could connect to. That would be very cool. But I think the young people are I think it's gonna happen because of the.
Well, one of the reasons why I wrote this book was that the idea is 20th century American history in 100 protest songs. So it's not intended to be a definitive version of 100 years of history, but it's about the issues that we were debating over the last 100 years, from women's rights to LGBT rights to civil rights to the environmental concerns. The early days from 50 years ago of what we now consider the climate change debate, which obviously your generation is very deep. My kids are teenagers, and that's their issue. That's what they want to talk about is what are we going to do about climate change? And so there's an environmental movement and songs attached to it that I read about in a certain chapter in this book. And so the idea is you'll learn something about American history, but through the music. And these 100 songs that I've chosen, I could have picked 1,000 songs, or I could have picked a different 100 songs, but I chose these 100, some of which are obvious, some of which are less obvious. And the idea is to, among other things, hopefully get the book into high school and college classrooms, assigned by history teachers.
Class. I would take
that
it.
would be awesome.
And so that's sort of, the book came out a few months ago, and the next school year obviously begins in a couple months. And so the next step for my publisher, Oxford University Press, would be to talk to history professors, American studies teachers, and those types of teachers, and get them to assign the book hopefully to the kids to. And some of my best audiences when I've done book readings have been high school and college students who've had great questions and have been very engaged, and have wanted to learn about the history, and also wanted to hear something about their own generation's music and how it applies to the ongoing spirit of protest in this country.
Yeah, I think that what you said about how you are really learning through the songs that you're talking about, that speaks volumes about the way that you wrote. I mean, I've only read a brief part of your book, but that really is so true. Like the stories and the detail that you give about each artist, and the song and the story behind the songs, it really is so interesting. That is a great way to learn, and I am a student, so even if I get a chance, we have gen eds at school. I go to Temple in Philly, and so all of my friends are very interested in music, and I can just see so many people, so many students really eating this book up, because it really is so well written. It's easy to read in the way that you just want to keep reading because you are learning.
Good.
But it's
Glad
fun.
to hear it.
Yeah, absolutely. So who knows? Maybe I'll stop by a professor and let them know.
Please do.
I will. I am that person to do that.
Right.
But definitely. But yeah, was just opening to the into the 21st century, which I think what you said about how students are more interested in kind of like hearing about today and like where that, because that is like a very interesting just topic to think about, because I don't really see artists getting that political. Like you said, like a lot of artists, they were speaking really politically, whereas like in like early 2000s, that was like obviously where hip hop came, and like that was super political because it was about like police brutality. And I think that is really kind of where police brutality, like as a movement, really rose up, which is like another.
Oh yeah, I mean, so as far as that goes, I mean, hip hop, rappers have been talking about that since hip hop started in the late 70s or early 80s, you know. So this last chapter that you just mentioned is just meant to bring the idea of the book full circle up to the present day. So it's, you know, sort of not just stopping with the 20th century, as I mentioned in the subtitle of the book, but, you know, to show that, like, for instance, I talk in this chapter a little bit about the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I mentioned earlier, and how music, you know, did feed that movement a little bit. And, you know, each of the issues that I covered in previous chapters, for each one, I kind of bring it up to date a little bit. I talk a little bit about the protests in Ferguson and other cities where there was incidents of police brutality, and the song that I chose for that discussion was Kendrick Lamar's "All Right," which became an anthem of sorts for the protesters in Ferguson. Which, you know, it's a great song. It's definitely political, and it was adopted by that movement when they were out on the streets protesting police brutality. They were chanting, "We gonna be all right," and you know, that was in its own way a kind of protest song. I talk about the women's movement and the Women's March on Washington, which occurred right after the current president was elected, and how huge that was. Obviously, there were 500,000 people in Washington and 750,000 in L.A. And in Washington, Alicia Keys basically performed a cappella her song "Girl on Fire," which was a big pop hit. And wasn't necessarily written to be political. It was just like, I'm an independent woman, I'm going to do what I want to do, and, you know, I feel good about it. And when she recited the song in front of 500,000 women at the Women's March in Washington, it took on a political tone, obviously. It was about, you know, the spirit of independence and womanhood at that rally. So that's another kind of protest song that might be overlooked, and it was another, you know, it was a popular song, you know, big hit. Absolutely. So there's examples of that throughout this last chapter, sort of bringing things to the present day.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's a lot of powerful songs, and I think that the way that you've done it by putting them all together, and I'm sure other people who have like highlighted protest songs, it's just a really powerful way of amplifying how powerful, because even when you're just talking about Alicia Keys, like, or Kendrick Lamar, like, I got goosebumps. I don't know if it just got cold in here or if it was just me envisioning like people really coming together.
Hopefully somebody turned the air conditioning up, right? Because it's 100 degrees
it's so
outside.
hot out, I know. But yeah, just envisioning people singing like, "We're gonna be all right," like, or "We gon' be all right." It's just, it's just really powerful to think about. So you've done a great job with your book, and I'm definitely going to encourage others to read it. Which Side Are You On by James Sullivan, local author. So thank you so much for coming. I don't know if Sarah, if you have any other questions to ask, but we are running low on time.
No, I mean, all I have to add is that I think it could be a really fun project to. I was thinking maybe, you know, of local musicians, maybe like E.J. Lett, who does work with a lot of students, maybe putting on a little workshop about how to go about writing a protest song, or what are the components of it, and maybe you'd like to be involved with something like that, just to get people thinking about it, and maybe being able to perform them here, because I think it's a great thing too for getting young people in touch with music if they haven't had the opportunity, or bringing people out that are into music and they haven't had the opportunity to share their music.
So I'll just say one last thing about what I hope to achieve with this book, which is that there's been a lot of talk lately about who gets to say whether they think there are aspects of American life that could be improved, and who supposedly doesn't get the opportunity to say that. There's been a lot of debate lately about who's more American than who. And, you know, this kind of falls into line with what you're doing here today.
Yes.
the whole country was founded on the spirit of protest. And the idea of the First Amendment is that every American has the right, unlike many other nations in the world, to speak their mind. And it doesn't make you less American to dissent or to protest or to say, and in fact, in some ways makes you, I mean, it's probably not fair to say it makes you more American, but it is absolutely an American trait.
Yes.
To say, we love this place, and there are always ways that we can better ourselves, and in those regards, we would like to express the ways that we feel we could make life in America better. And so, just the idea that protest is inherently written into the American contract is a really important point that I hope continues to be made, obviously way beyond my book, but, for people who think that, hey, if you're complaining, go ahead, get out of here. Like, love it or leave it. We've heard that a lot lately, and we've heard people saying, wow, I haven't heard that since the Vietnam years, when young people were protesting the Vietnam War, and others were saying, hey, if you don't like it, get out of here, move to Canada, right? Like, that's not the way it goes in America. Like, the idea is you have the right to speak your mind and to argue if you want to and protest if you want to.
That's a great point. Yeah, no, I love how you put that. So, and it does fall in line with our independence theme for the day. So
I know, I was very happy. I have to say, Jess is so awesome because she, I told her about some of these components of this independence celebration, and she was like, yes, that's something I can do. And she was here for the first one. So this is our third one. And it takes time to grow. I think that people kind of just take it for granted, our Constitution, what it means, but dissent is such an important part. If we can't dissent, then we can't hold people accountable. And there's no questioning anything. If everybody wants that, and that whole movement of teens, I think that's very cool. I never really thought about that. And the importance of their growth and development, and how important youth culture is in making change, and holding people accountable.
I think Jessica's generation, whether it's from the acceptance of LGBT to the issues of police brutality to the issues of climate change, you guys are really have strong thoughts about all of that, and are going to make a difference as far as all of that goes, I think, and that's really important. You're using your voice, and that's the idea. Everyone should have the opportunity to use their voice in America, and when someone in a position of leadership says, hey, if you don't like it, get out, stop complaining, that's dangerous.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I appreciate it. And I also do agree. I think it is really all rooted out of love. I think it always has been. Yeah. Love for, anti-war. It's all about just peace, and whether it's about police brutality. People who are stepping up who aren't even a part of it. But one thing I don't want to forget is I love the idea of the protest song workshop. And I think that would be really cool for the Hub, even, because we produce music here. Yeah. And yeah, that is a great idea.
Yeah,
I love that.
I think it could be fun. It would be a nice collaboration. I mean, we have a library genre of protest music, but we haven't had a chance to, it's kind of clumped into history, so there's some that aren't exactly appropriate, so I need to pull them out and make a few specific lists of protest songs with all sorts of music. Tyler did put one together, but we have a lot of variety that we can make a few, and then have during the week a few hours that would be just dedicated to music that would be considered protest music, and or has some sort of theme. So it's also a nice opportunity for someone, like you had mentioned this song, but for students to maybe say, if they find something that we can put it on, we can play it on the radio. So yeah, it's great. I just love the whole thing with protest songs. I just think it's great. Yeah.
Good.
Maybe Tyler will write us a protest song and we can play it on the playlist. Coming out soon. Right. So yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up. But thank you so much, James. It was so nice having you. Maybe we can go enjoy some coffee.
Sure.
I know it's hot out, so we're not all trying to eat too many cookies today, but there are cookies. So
good.
Yeah, thank you so much.